He says he's for health. But what happens when America's top health official has a history of spreading health misinformation? In this video, we break down the claims of Robert F. Kennedy Jr., now appointed as Secretary of Health and Human Services, and compare his words to hard medical science. The truth may shock you.
Welcome to the Deep Dive. This is the show where we take the stack of sources you bring us, maybe articles, research papers, could be your own notes, and we dive deep into them together.
Yep, our mission is really to help you cut through all that noise, pull out the important stuff, the insights, and help you get genuinely well-informed, quickly.
We're basically your navigators for this info landscape. We point out what's significant, help you get the context, without getting totally bogged down.
Exactly, and for this deep dive, we're looking at source material you shared about health claims made by RFK Jr.
Specifically, we're going to focus on a doctor's analysis, a detailed refutation of those claims, all based on the material provided.
Yeah, our goal here is to surface the main points the doctor makes, understand the context given for RFK Jr.'s views, and then see how the scientific data, as discussed in the source, directly pushes back on specific claims.
Okay, so the sources cover quite a bit. There's the doctor's initial strong criticism, a look at RFK Jr.'s background, how his views seemingly evolved.
Right, and then it breaks down specific claims he's made, followed point by the doctor's counter-arguments using scientific data from the source. It's a lot to cover.
It is, but we'll zero in on what really stands out. Think of this less like us reading from the sources and more like exploring them together, pulling out what's significant, maybe even surprising.
Okay, let's unpack this then. So the source material kicks off with a doctor who's clearly very critical of RFK Jr.'s public health stances.
Right. The source says the doctor acknowledges that, yes, people are frustrated with healthcare systems. That's valid.
But they draw a really firm line, arguing we absolutely must follow the data, the scientific evidence, not what they call cherry picking or even fabricating information.
The sources then give a bit of background on RFK Jr. before getting into the, let's say, more controversial parts. Notes his earlier work, 1990s, environmental attorney suing polluters.
Which the doctor in the source actually calls good stuff, kind of sets up a contrast.
Yeah, a big contrast with where he focused next. The material highlights that around 2005 he started this, public campaign targeting mercury in vaccines specifically.
And that grew, led him to join the World Mercury Project in 2015, which, then became Children's Health Defense in 2018.
Where he served as chairman, and the source points out, sold related merchandise too.
And the sources also trace his political path. Ran for president as a Democrat first, then switched to independent.
And eventually ended up endorsing Donald Trump. It's interesting, the sources frame this not really as left versus right politics.
No, more fundamentally about truth and, accurate health information. That seems to be the angle in the source.
According to the material, soon after taking office, Trump gave Kennedy this broad assignment related to health, quoting things like, I'm going to let him go wild on health, on the food, on medicines.
But the sources note he still needed Senate confirmation for a specific role, Secretary of Health and Human Services.
And during that process, which the source puts in February 2025, he apparently kept distancing himself from that anti-vaccine label.
Yeah, the source explicitly quotes him, I am not anti-vaccine, and I have never been anti-vax, things like that.
So this is where the source material really presents what the doctor sees as a clear evolution or maybe a contradiction in his stance.
Right. It contrasts those confirmation statements with comments quoted from back in 2014.
Back then, he apparently said, I am very pro-vaccine, stated, I have 6 children. I had all 6 of my children vaccinated.
And even said things like, vaccines are critical to public health, have saved hundreds of millions of lives. Strong stuff.
And notably, the source also quotes him from 2014 admitting, I know very little about vaccines, saying his focus then was mostly mercury.
Okay, but fast forward to 2020. The sources quote a really different take. Asked if he'd give his young kids the MMR vaccine now.
His quoted answer is just no.
The doctor in the source finds that really telling, directly contrasts it with, vaccinating his own kids earlier and being generally pro-vaccine.
The material even includes this anecdote, where he apparently says he never told the public to avoid vaccination.
And then immediately tells a story about meeting someone on a hiking trail and telling them not to get their baby vaccinated. It's quite the juxtaposition in the source.
Yeah. And what the doctor in the source describes as quite concerning is RFK Jr.'s apparent belief that vaccinated kids are somehow less bright.
Right. The source quotes him describing vaccinated kids as completely different compared to unvaccinated ones who he says have bright eyes and the engagement.
And maybe the most jarring part of this section, there's this really disturbing analogy quoted in the source.
The one comparing modern doctors who vaccinate to Nazis. The quote is, "To me, this is like Nazis' death camps. I can't tell you why ordinary Germans participated in the Holocaust. Just wow."
Despite all these public statements and views, the sources state he was confirmed as HHS Secretary in February 2025.
Putting him in charge of huge agencies, CDC, FDA, NIH, the whole lot.
And then, the sources point out what seems like another shift, back again after confirmation. Quoting him saying things like,
"The best way to prevent the spread of measles is through vaccination. We urge people to get their MMR vaccines."
the doctor in the source finds this pretty ironic. They contrast it with how the CDC might change guidance, but that's usually based on new scientific data.
Whereas RFK Jr.'s shifts, as presented in the source, seem to happen without that clear scientific basis. At least that's the doctor's perspective in the material.
Okay, let's really dig into the main part of this deep dive now. The doctor's direct engagement with and refutation of specific claims attributed to RFK Jr. in the source material. This is where the data comes in.
Right, and probably the most persistent claim discussed is that vaccines cause autism. The source quotes RFK Jr. stating, "I don't think there's any scientific question that vaccines cause autism if you actually read the science."
And the doctor's response, as presented in the source, is pretty definitive. The science is very clear on this, that there is no causal link.
They point to studies, huge studies, involving millions of children, comparing vaccinated versus unvaccinated groups.
And they consistently show no link between vaccines and autism.
The sources specifically call out that big research effort covering over 500,000 children in Denmark.
Oh yeah, the doctor in the source emphasizes that one because it's seen as independent of the whole corrupt American capitalistic system argument you sometimes hear from skeptics.
Exactly, and it found the same thing, no link.
So the doctor's point, as laid out in the sources, is that any connection people see is just timing, correlation.
Like SIA, sudden infant death syndrome, tragically peaking around the same age kids get early vaccines. It happens at the same time, but one doesn't cause the other.
They use that analogy from the source too, right?
Yeah.
The graph showing organic food sales rising alongside autism rates.
Precisely. Just because two lines go together doesn't mean one caused the other. The doctor says firmly this vaccine autism link needs to be put to bed. It's been disproven internationally.
Okay, moving on. The source material addresses another claim, this one about what's in the MMR vaccine.
Yes, RFK Jr. quoted saying he wouldn't give it because it contains a lot of aborted fetus debris and DNA particles.
And the doctor in the source counters this really directly, calls the claim factually untrue.
They explain the components, measles and mumps parts, made using chick embryos, nothing to do with fetal tissue.
Okay, but what about the rubella part?
That is derived from viruses grown in human cells. And this is key in the source, these cells originated from 2 elective and ethical abortions performed over 50 years ago.
Right, and those same cell lines have just been reused ever since then.
So the doctor emphasizes in the source, there is no fetal tissue, no fetal debris in the final vaccine, calls the claim illogical.
And the DNA particles bit.
The sources say the presence is tightly controlled, like a billionth of a gram, a picogram. Super tiny amount. High amounts could cause issues, theoretically, but it's monitored. The doctor insists it's just physically not there in any meaningful quantity.
Got it. Okay, next up in the sources. Claims about the rotavirus vaccine, specifically one developed by Dr. Paul Offit.
The claim attributed to RFK Jr. basically suggests this vaccine caused negative net public health impacts, like it injured or killed more kids than the disease did before the vaccine.
And the source quotes RFK Jr. saying he's comfortable reading science and dissecting it and discerning the difference between junk science and real science.
Well, the doctor in the source disagrees with that assertion, especially about this vaccine. They bring out the data from the sources.
Okay, what does the data show?
Before the vaccine, 2006, rotavirus put 50,000 to 70,000 U.S. kids in the hospital each year and caused 50 to 60 deaths annually in the U.S. alone.
And after the vaccine came in?
U.S. hospitalizations dropped by 50,000, according to the source. A huge drop.
Wow, and the global impact?
Even bigger, the sources say, especially in developing countries without good medical care, credited with saving over 100,000 lives across the globe.
So the doctor in the source calls this vaccine a scientific miracle.
Yeah, and finds it basically incomprehensible how anyone could see it as a net negative based on that data.
The doctor also criticizes RFK Jr.'s approach, right, like looking at pamphlet side effects.
Exactly. As described in the sources, focusing on minor things like headaches listed on the pamphlet without comparing that to unvaccinated kids who also get headaches naturally.
The key question, the doctor says, is whether the rate goes up because of the vaccine.
And the sources say the data shows pretty much no.
Okay, another major point of contention in the sources, Thimerosal, the mercury-based preservative.
Right, the claim it might have caused autism. The sources mention RFK Jr.'s famous article, Deadly Immunity, published in Salon and Rolling Stone.
Which made that claim about mercury causing autism and alleged a government cover-up.
The doctor in the source is highly critical of that article, calls it so poorly written, mentions it needed 5 corrections.
It was finally being retracted. Yeah, the editor is quoted in the sources calling it the worst mistake of her life.
Ouch. But here's what's really striking from the timeline in the sources. The FDA asked manufacturers to remove thimerosal as a precaution back on July 1st, 1999.
And that article, written 6 years later.
Right. And the sources confirm, today, all routine vaccines recommended for children 6 years of age and younger are available without thimerosal.
And that removal was just precautionary. The sources state, no research has found any increased health risk from it ever being there.
So the doctor in the sources makes a simple logical point. If thimerosal really caused autism, you'd expect autism rates to crumble once thimerosal was removed.
Which, according to the sources, just didn't happen. Rates continued to rise for other reasons.
And yet, despite the article retraction and the timeline, the sources note RFK Jr. wrote a whole book about this in 2014.
Let's pivot to some of the statistical claims that are highlighted and corrected in the sources. First one, U.S. drug spending.
Ah, yes. The source quotes RFK Jr. saying, "We are 4.2% of the world's population. We buy 70% of the pharmaceutical drugs on Earth."
Okay, what's the doctor's correction in the sources?
Pretty straightforward. U.S. is about 4% of world population, sure, but buys around 6 to 8% of drugs by volume. Not 70%. Big difference.
What about the money spent? Is that 70%?
Nope. Sources indicate the U.S. spends about 40 to 50% of the global total on drugs, not 70%, partly because new, expensive drugs often launch here first.
Still high, but yeah, a big difference from the claim, as the doctor notes.
Then there's another set of stats the sources address. Diabetes rates, children, and China.
Right, RFK Jr. is quoted describing a pediatrician who supposedly saw maybe 1 case of diabetes in a lifetime back in the day.
But now sees it in 1 out of every 3 kids that walks through his office door.
1 in 3 kids. The doctor's correction in the sources.
Pretty blunt. No, not 1 of 3 children is diabetic. States the actual rate for kids up to age 18 is less than 0.4%.
So more like 1 in 300, not 1 in 3.
Exactly. The doctor in the sources calls that level of exaggeration dangerous.
And the claim about China.
RFK Jr. quoted in the source. 20 years ago, there was no diabetes in China. Today, 50% of the population is diabetic.
50%, that sounds huge. What do the sources say the real number is?
50% of China is not diabetic. The actual rate is estimated somewhere around 12 to 13%.
Still incredibly high, as the doctor notes, but nowhere near 50%.
Right. And the doctor's reaction to these, as presented in the sources, is pretty strong. Remarks that kind of butchering of statistics would require, like, remediation for a medical resident.
Finds it a serious problem for someone leading health agencies to do this repeatedly without correction, according to the source.
Yeah. Okay, the sources also bring up a really controversial claim that HIV doesn't cause AIDS.
Suggesting something else does, like poppers. They mention a New York Magazine interview, June 2023.
Where RFK Jr. is cited saying, "Nobody knows whether HIV is the sole cause of AIDS. There are much better candidates than HIV.
So the doctor's interpretation in the sources is, he's not just suggesting another virus, but maybe it's not a virus at all, or just a passenger virus.
Seems to be the implication. And then the specific quote about poppers from the source. "These people are dying mainly because of poppers. 100% of the people who died in the first 1,000 who had AIDS were people who were addicted to poppers."
Wow. The doctor's refutation in the source.
Calls it a ridiculous claim. Points to the huge drop in the AIDS death rate, the massively increased lifespan for people with HIV.
Directly because of antiviral medication.
Exactly. The doctor labels this straight-up HIV denialism, says it's devoid of any scientific factual logic.
Okay, next claim discussed in the sources. MMR vaccine immunity waning really fast.
Right. RFK Jr. quoted saying, the vaccine wanes about 4.5% per year. So that means older people are essentially unvaccinated.
4.5% per year. That sounds like a lot. What does the doctor say in the source?
That's just not true. Cites a study in The Lancet, a top medical journal.
And that study found
The actual waning rate is 0.04% per year.
0.04 compared to 4.5. That's
Yeah.
vastly different.
Yeah, the doctor emphasizes the drastically different outcome over a lifetime. It's a huge difference in how long immunity lasts.
They do acknowledge, right, that maybe for some very specific cases, like older healthcare workers, immunity might be checked.
Yes, the source mentions checking MMR titers for some individuals, maybe over 75, for certain jobs might be reasonable, but the 4.5% figure itself, just not accurate.
Okay, this next one seems pretty fundamental. The claim that vaccines aren't safety tested before licensure.
And that they need placebo-controlled trials. The source quotes RFK Jr., vaccines are the only medical product that is not safety tested prior to licensure, and we need placebo-controlled trials.
The doctor's reaction in the source to this one sounds pretty strong.
Extremely strong. Quotes them saying, I can't believe I have to educate the person who's in charge of the CDC, FDA, and NIH, but vaccines do undergo placebo-randomized controlled studies.
And they give examples, like the COVID vaccines.
Yep, tested on tens of thousands in placebo trials, as the source notes.
So how does the process usually work, according to the doctor in the source?
New vaccines do get initial placebo trials. That's standard. But once a vaccine's safety and effectiveness are known...
You don't keep using placebos for updates.
Right. New versions are usually tested against the existing standard of care, the already approved vaccine, because it's considered unethical to withhold treatment when you know something works and is beneficial.
Which the sources note is similar to how new drugs are tested too, right? Compared against the best current treatment.
Exactly the same principle.
So the doctor strongly asserts vaccines are incredibly well tested.
Even more well tested than pharmaceuticals, according to the source, because they're given to healthy people, so the bar of safety has to be higher.
Plus, they mentioned the ongoing monitoring systems, right? The Vaccine Safety Data Net.
Yeah, tracking millions of doses after they're administered, it's continuous.
So the doctor's conclusion in the source is that saying they aren't tested is just part of a broader crusade of trying to discredit vaccines.
Seems to be their take. Okay, shifting gears a bit, the sources touch on diet and personal actions.
The steak and shake thing. Context is a Charlie Kirk tweet showing RFK Jr. eating there.
And positively highlighting that the restaurant fries in beef tallow. That is the way, MAJ.
Meanwhile, RFK Jr. is quoted in the sources while eating fast food, talking about how we're poisoning ourselves with ultra-processed foods.
And advocating for companies to switch to traditional ingredients like beef tallow, claiming tallow was good for you. Your body needs that. It makes you healthy.
So what's the doctor's counterpoint in the sources?
It's not just the oil, it's the over-consuming ultra-processed foods overall. That's the bigger issue.
And the sources point out the contradiction. RFK Jr.'s own report apparently talks about the dangers of ultra-processed foods.
Yet here, his allies are celebrating fast food chains that serve exactly that.
The doctor's reaction in the sources is pretty pointed, calling the claim that fast food fries with tallow make you healthy.
Especially coming from someone heading a health agency as fully making things up. Stresses that America's real problems are over-consuming saturated fat and ultra-processed foods generally, affecting all parts of our lives.
Okay, next, claim the sources address the origin of Lyme disease.
RFK Jr. quoted mentioning falconers with brain fog, Lyme symptoms, and the idea that the disease is highly likely to have been a military weapon.
A military weapon?
Yeah.
The doctor's refutation in the sources.
Absolutely definitive, with 100% certainty wrong.
What's the evidence presented in the source?
Traces of Lyme disease found going back 60,000 years. Ticks carrying related bacteria found in amber from dinosaur days. Ticks that fed on dinosaurs.
So definitely not a recent military creation.
No. The doctor in the sources calls extrapolating those kinds of ideas with no scientific basis pretty scary, especially from a leader.
Another claim tackled, SIDs, sudden infant death syndrome being caused by vaccines.
RFK Jr. quoted in the source, there are plenty of studies that make it clear that SIDs is caused by vaccines. SIDs really appeared following the first vaccine.
And the doctor's immediate response from the sources.
There are no studies showing that, flat out.
So why do some people think there's a link? The sources explain it.
Purely the timing again. SIDs tragically peaks at 2 to 4 months, same time many first vaccines are given. It's just coincidence and timing.
But when researchers actually study it, Look for a causal link.
There is no relationship found, the sources state emphatically.
And the doctor even mentioned some preliminary evidence suggesting the opposite.
Yeah, that there might be a potentially lower risk of SIDs if a child is up to date with vaccines. The doctor notes they're hedging it slightly, being careful with preliminary data.
Contrasting that scientific caution with RFK Jr.'s approach as presented of seeing two things happen together and just claiming causation without evidence.
Exactly. Okay, nearly there. The last specific claim area covered in the sources is about the HPV vaccine, human papillomavirus.
Which prevents cancers, right?
Yeah.
Especially cervical cancer.
Yeah.
The sources mention it as a prime example of a cancer-preventing vaccine, citing the drop in rates.
Yes. But despite that, the sources highlight a quoted tweet from RFK Jr., apparently still up, stating, Gardasil HPV vaccine appears to be increasing the risk of cervical cancer in vaccinated age groups.
Increasing the risk. What does the data presented by the doctor and the source say?
It's overwhelming in the other direction. Studies from Sweden and England, millions of young women showed dramatically lower cancer rates, like 63% to 88% lower in vaccinated groups.
Wow. Any other data points?
Yep. A big multi-country analysis cited by the WHO. 50% drop in high-grade precancerous lesions within a decade. And U.S. data from the CDC, an 80% drop in cervical precancers among 20 to 24-year-olds.
So the data is just crystal clear, according to the doctor.
Yeah, the doctor's point in the sources is that the drop in cancer and precancerous lesions is so obvious to see. States RFK Jr. sees some sort of risk that no other scientific organization in the globe can see.
Okay, so beyond all those specific claims, the source material raises some broader concerns from the doctor's perspective about RFK Jr.'s views and his role.
Definitely. One statement quoted in the sources is particularly alarming to the doctor. RFK Jr. saying, we should not be giving Black people the same vaccine schedule that's given to whites.
The doctor describes that statement as scary.
And the doctor's overall view, summed up in the sources, is that RFK Jr.'s track record makes him a clear threat to millions of Americans.
That he should have never been confirmed.
And that leaving him in charge of health agencies is like giving car keys to someone who insists stop signs and red lights are optional. That's the analogy used in the source.
The sources also note the doctor's worries about the potential impact on science itself, like firing scientists or slashing budgets based on views, not evidence.
Right. And the doctor's perspective, again from the source, is that focusing on things like food dyes, seen as maybe PR stunts, distracts from the real problems.
Like the massive issue of ultra-processed foods and rising obesity rates.
Exactly. Those are seen as the real crises needing attention.
And finally, the source material you provided concludes with the doctor making a call to action.
Yeah, demanding immediate resignation, urging viewers to contact Congress, even suggesting language. We're just presenting that as what's contained in the source material you brought us.
Wow, okay. That was quite the deep dive through the sources you provided. We've definitely unpacked a lot there.
For sure. The core tension running through all this material, as the doctor presents it, is just this stark contrast. Numerous health and science claims attributed to RFK Jr. on one side,
And the scientific data and evidence cited by the doctor refuting them on the other. It really lays out a fundamental disagreement on how scientific information is interpreted and used, especially when it comes to public health leadership.
And that really is the value of doing this kind of deep dive, taking the sources you have, really looking closely, seeing not just the claims,
But how those claims seem to hold up or don't when they're examined against the available data and the expert analysis presented in this material.
hopefully this whole exploration has given you some solid detail, specific points to kind of hold on to as you encounter information on these really important topics out there.
So thinking about everything presented in these sources, the conflating claims, the counter evidence, maybe here's something to consider.
In today's world, just absolutely overflowing with information, often contradictory narratives about health, about science, what methods or maybe what sources do you find yourself relying on to figure out what's accurate, what feels trustworthy?
Something to think about. Thank you for bringing us the sources for this deep dive.
Keep exploring and keep questioning.